Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session. This is particularly satisfying for me because SAS has had for many years, we've had an initiative called Data for Good, where we work with various organizations around the world to use the power of SAS analytics to help with real-world problems, and especially oftentimes in areas that are devastated by natural disasters and things of that nature. So we're very pleased to have Nate Hawken with us today from the Institute for Peace, yeah? Or Fund for Peace.
That's right.
Fund for Peace. Tell me the right.
The Fund for Peace.
Fund for Peace, that's right. For some reason I had Institute in my brain. So Nate, before we jump into the great work that you're doing, if you just want to let everybody know who you are and what you do and kind of the scope of your work, that'd be great.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. I work for the Fund for Peace. I'm a senior advisor there. I've been at the Fund for Peace for about 20 years. And at the Fund for Peace, we do a lot of work on conflict early warning. We do conflict sensitivity analysis, working with multilateral development banks and private sector, as well as USAID before they were dismantled over the last couple of months, as you all know. And so we've been really excited about this opportunity to work with SAS over the last couple of years because we've been collecting a lot of data and trying to understand difficult problems around the world. And SAS was so generous to kind of come alongside us and really help us develop some models to really think about how we can take this data and move from diagnostic outputs to more of a prognostic and decision support approach to how we actually solve these difficult problems around the world. So the question that we're trying to answer here is imagine that there is a major shock in your country. It could be a natural disaster, it could be a pandemic, it could be a military incursion. And as we all know, when that happens, it tends to compound and cascade. So a health crisis turns into an economic crisis, turns into a social crisis, turns sometimes into a political crisis, sometimes can turn into a security crisis. And so if you just treat the crisis as if it's a health crisis, you're going to not be successful at mitigating the humanitarian impact of that crisis. So this was really the struggle that we were trying to attack with this project. It particularly became evident during COVID, when in some countries it truly was a health crisis. In some countries, like the United States, where we thought that we would be the best prepared to respond to a potential, to respond to a potential pandemic. In fact, there was a major index that came out the year before the pandemic. I believe Hopkins generated this really robust and rich and valuable index. But what they predicted with their index was that the United States would be the best prepared to deal with the crisis. Of course, we know that because it was much more than simply a health crisis, it ultimately became very complex and very challenging for a whole lot of reasons. And so this happens all over the world. You know, whenever there's a natural disaster, you can't simply treat it as a natural disaster. Otherwise, you'll completely miss the boat when it comes to preparedness and response. So this is what we're trying to do. How do you know where to act first? What are your strategic points of entry? Where can you actually intervene in a way that you can mitigate the humanitarian harm when any particular type of crisis strikes? So that's what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do here. So hit that one. So let me start by going over briefly what we'll be going over in this presentation. And I'll leave time for questions. I just ask that you don't ask hard questions. Only ask easy questions, if you please. I'm just joking, of course. So what we'll try to do here today is we'll talk about the crisis sensitivity challenge. What is the challenge we're trying to address with this project, with this system that we built with SAS Data for Good. We'll describe briefly what the crisis sensitivity simulator is and what it does. We'll talk about how it takes a triangulated approach as kind of an agentic model or an agentic system, recognizing that AI on its own has to be combined with expert judgment and also quantitative analytics in order to really identify your strategic points of entry. And then we'll talk a little bit about a brief case study. We did a case study in Nigeria last year using this tool. And then hopefully I'll get a chance to give you a bit of a live walkthrough if that works out, if I have enough time and if I can make that happen. Here is the crisis sensitivity simulator. This is just a screenshot, and I'll go through what this does over the course of this presentation. Over the last 20 years or so, I have been working in conflict and fragile countries around the world. I've been working mainly in Africa, but also some in the Middle East and some in Asia as well, and a little bit in Latin America. And so this is a challenge that it's faced all over the world. You know, this complexity that we're trying to understand and really grapple with this crisis sensitivity simulator. Over the last 20 years that I've been working in this field, of course, the world has become more volatile. The shocks have become more frequent and more intense. And we see that, you know, in 2008, there was a major food crisis. Commodity prices spiked, and that really kind of showed issues around the supply chain globally. Then, of course, there was Syria, which happened, and so you had a huge migration crisis that occurred, which had all kinds of cascading and compounding effects across the world. And then, you know, we had COVID, we had the 2009 financial crisis. So these shocks have been really hitting the world with increased frequency and increased intensity. And we can only assume that given the structural changes that are happening, and even geopolitically, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about changes in geopolitics and priorities. I mentioned USAID was dismantled. We have other guardrails that are being, you know, kind of eroded. So we're seeing more volatility as the years progress. And so we need to find ways to really be more strategic and more tactical in addressing these challenges. Because with fewer and fewer resources available to address this, we need to be we need to know what the strategic points of entry are in order to have multiplier effects and synergy in our interventions, whether that be, you know, working on flooding in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, or whether, you know, we have the situation in Ukraine or elsewhere around the world. So that's what we're trying to do with this particular project. So what problems does the crisis sensitivity simulator try to solve? There's the tactical problem, and then there's the methodological problem. The tactical problem, of course, is that we have fewer and fewer resources, and so you need to be able to use these resources very efficiently to really deploy those resources in a way where you will have multiplier effects and synergies in order to address these very complex cascading and compounding problems. So that's a huge challenge that's only becoming more and more important as decision makers struggle to prioritize where and how to act when multiple crises cascade simultaneously. Then we have the methodological problem, and we have data gaps, certainly, but then beyond even just the data gaps, traditional approaches tend to rely either on quantitative data, which may have gaps or lags, or they'll rely exclusively on expert judgment, which has its own biases, and challenges associated with that. Or now we see AI emerging as a really powerful tool, but of course you can't use AI on its own without also integrating these other methods. So if we just use quant or qual or generative AI alone, there will be blind spots, biases, and missed opportunities in order to anticipate the cascading impacts of a particular crisis. So that's what we were really trying to do with SAS Data for Good, is to really kind of grapple with this methodological problem of how do we integrate these various methods in a systematic way so that it can be more effective at really helping decision makers to identify those strategic points of entry for maximum leverage. So, as I mentioned, the challenge of complexity is huge and growing. Whenever there is a crisis, it is rarely confined to a single domain. And then the crises, because it's never a single crisis, it's a very complex crisis, it will be interconnected and will require cross-sectoral approaches to deal with it. So you need the triple nexus of peace, humanitarian, and development interventions in order to really address the complexity of the challenges that the world is facing today. And then, thirdly, limited resources, and those limitations in the resources are becoming even more limited as time goes on. It's a huge problem and needs to be dealt with. We need to use advanced analytics in order to really figure out how to really grapple with this. In order that we can be more proactive, because when you have limited resources, people tend to defer to reactive approaches. You don't want to spend money on things that you don't know it's going to be valuable to spend it on. You need to wait until the problem actually is staring you right in the face before you actually are able to feel confident to spend your money. But if you wait until the problem is staring you right in the face, then the problem is already so huge that it's going to take much more resources in order to deal with it. So that's the dilemma that we're facing with in the world today. So I call that the everything, everywhere, all at once dilemma. We have been talking in this field about the fact that, as I mentioned, a health crisis is never just a health crisis. Well, sometimes it's just a health crisis, but sometimes it's not. You might have a commodity price shock, which leads to maybe it leads to poverty, which then leads to adverse health outcomes, which maybe also leads to forced migration, which maybe then leads to food insecurity as communities are struggling to deal with increased populations, and that can then ultimately lead to violence as well. Or maybe the problem will start with a pandemic, or maybe it will start with the displacement crisis because of a natural disaster. But either way, you have these vicious cycles that inevitably will occur. So how do we even begin to try to understand and get our heads around the complexity? Because you can see that I put arrows around that, but the arrows could go in any of the other directions as well. You could have the violence leading to disease, leading to food insecurity, leading to poverty. In some cases, it might be more within violence and poverty. In some cases, it might be more around displacement and food insecurity. It's a very wicked problem that we're trying to understand. So what the Fund for Peace has been doing over the last 19 years is we've developed the Fragile States Index, which has been measuring cohesion, economic, political, and social pressures in 179 countries around the world, looking at these 12 indicators: security apparatus, factionalized elites, group grievance, economic decline, inequality, human flight and brain drain. You see state legitimacy issues, public services, human rights and rule of law, demographic pressures. Those can include things like natural disasters. They can include migration issues as well, refugees, IDPs, and of course external interventions, which ultimately can be extremely problematic. And so we've been collecting all this data mainly as a diagnostic tool, just to say, okay, what's been happening in country X or country Y over the last 19 years? But what we realized was that that's not really enough to help us know how to plan ahead, because you can't just say, okay, this is what's been happening, over the last X number of years. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the problem that you're going to face next year or in the next decade, because the context is continually changing, and also, different countries are different. And so, this diagnostic tool that we developed with the Fragile States Index, it's very valuable, but it also doesn't tell you when if a shock were to hit a particular country, what will be the humanitarian impact of that shock? How severe and how widespread might that shock be? So these are the questions that the Fragile States Index alone doesn't answer. So because of that, we partnered with SAS Data for Good to really try to get our heads around this, looking at this rich data set that we had developed over the last 19 years, and try to understand how we can use that to model a more prognostic tool in combination with AI enhancements in order to be more strategic about crisis preparedness. So here's the problem that we face. I did a lot of work in West Africa. I did a lot of conflict sensitivity analysis and contextual risk analysis with government actors and civil society and development practitioners in countries like Nigeria and Mali and Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. And inevitably, we found ourselves kind of falling into the same three traps. The first trap is that whenever you're trying to prepare for a future crisis, because you have limited resources, you need to be careful how you spend those resources. You simply cannot do everything everywhere all at once. As much as the analysts tell you that that is the only way to really be prepared for a crisis, is to really prepare for the entire scope of the possible cascading effects, that is unrealistic because people don't have enough resources to do that. So what they tend to do, is to default to precedent. You say, well, last cycle there was a major flood in 2022 in the Niger Delta. These are the things that happened. Let's learn from that experience and prepare for the next flood based on what happened last time. And that's smart, but it doesn't really get to the nut of the issue. That's just defaulting to precedent, preparing to fight the last war. Of course, we know that given the fact that the world is becoming more volatile, the shocks are becoming more intense, more frequent, and more variant, you can't simply prepare for the future based on what happened in the past. So that's not really going to help. The next challenge, or the next trap that people fall into is to be, well, therefore, if we can't prepare for everything, everywhere, all at once, let's just keep our powder dry and let's not spend any money until the shock hits, and we'll see where it hits and what happened, and then we'll spend the money then. So that's the whack-a-mole crisis management approach. And that also perhaps can be smart from a resource allocation perspective in the short run. But the problem, of course, is that we all know that a penny of preparedness is going to ultimately be better than, or a penny of prevention is better than an ounce of cure, or whatever the phrase is. You get the idea. It's much more expensive to wait until the crisis hits and then spend the money, because after things have started to break, by then you're in a huge mess. So it's much better to kind of think tactically and strategically about your strategic points of entry and your leverage points and your spheres of influence in order to do that, in order to be better prepared for the crisis when it hits. And then the third trap that we always find ourselves in is that it's influence-driven prioritization. So if you get a bunch of people in a room and you say, okay, let's develop a scenario plan around, maybe there's a big election coming up, and we know that there's likely to be election violence, and that election violence is going to lead to all kinds of challenges economically and socially, and in terms of security, and all these cascading effects. What should we do in order to be better prepared when that crisis occurs? If you don't have a model that can kind of help you more kind of in a robust quantitative way identify what the strategic points of entry should be, you don't have a whole lot of resources to prepare to do everything everywhere all at once, you basically defer to the loudest voice in the room. So you're sitting around a table for 3 days, with a whole bunch of important people, and it's the loudest voice, the guy with the biggest pocketbook, who gets to say, well, this is how things are going to go. This is how what we're going to prioritize. This is the sequence that we're going to take in terms of rollout, and that, of course, has lots of challenges associated with it as well. So these are the 3 traps that we tend to fall into if we don't have a tool like the crisis sensitivity simulator. And so over the last couple of years, we looked at our data, and we worked with SAS Data for Good, and we started thinking about what kinds of models we can develop in order to really help users to be more strategic. So thinking about conflict early warning or risk, it doesn't have to be conflict. It can be health. It can be a natural disaster. When you talk about a risk matrix, you often talk about likelihood of crisis and severity of impact. The likelihood of the crisis, as challenging as that might be to forecast, it's actually the easy part. It's fairly easy to know, relatively speaking, it's fairly easy to know what types of crisis you're likely to face in country A, B, or C. In some countries, you're more prone to violent extremism, for example. In some countries, you're more prone to health problems, disease burden. In some countries, you're more prone to, floods and hurricanes. I mean, obviously, some countries aren't going to face any hurricanes because they're not in a hurricane area, and some countries are. So being able to predict the likelihood of a crisis is not that hard to do. But what is hard to do is to predict the severity of the impact and also the cascading effects of that impact, because that's where we find ourselves, really getting bogged down in the humanitarian field, is really being able to say, okay, so when the crisis that we've predicted occurs, how do we anticipate all the compounding and cascading effects of that crisis, and how can we therefore mitigate the overall impact of that crisis through allocation of resources and personnel in very strategic points of entry. So that's the challenge. So if you have, say in the top right corner there, that's like say in the Niger Delta. I'll come back to that case study in a few minutes. The likelihood is very high to have a catastrophic flood situation in the Niger Delta. And based on the tool that we developed with SAS Data for Good, we also identified that the severity of the impact is also very high. So that means that if you're dealing with a catastrophic flood situation in River State or Bayelsa State or Delta State in the Niger Delta, that's where we want to focus our efforts at really building out a scenario plan for preparedness and prevention. So this brings us to this issue of crisis sensitivity. This is sensitivity as opposed to likelihood. Crisis sensitivity refers to how different types of shocks tend to cascade and amplify within a country. As I mentioned, it's not the same as crisis probability. It's more about, there can be a type of crisis that is low probability but high impact, for example. So it's not the same as crisis probability. And country-specific factors play a major role in how sensitive a country might be to that perfect storm. What is the perfect storm in the United States or in Nigeria or in some other country? How can we identify what the perfect storm might be, and then how can we plan for that perfect storm in a more strategic and cost-effective way? Country-specific factors can include such things as governance and social cohesion and economic structures and environmental conditions, and these types of contextual factors shape these sensitivity profiles. So, solving the tactical problem, how then do you prioritize under pressure? You need to take a systematic approach to the problem, and the crisis sensitivity simulator helps us do that. As I said, it focuses more on crisis sensitivity rather than probability. So it understands how shocks are likely to cascade and amplify, not just where they will occur. It takes a systems approach to crisis. So it's not just like what are the risks, but what are the relationships between the risks, rather than just looking at each crisis as an isolated event that you need to mitigate. And then it identifies and responds to the most salient correlates. So this is where the modeling comes in order to help us prioritize based on patterns of historical cascading crises in the 179 countries that we work in around the world. So ultimately, what we hope is that this will do is that it will reduce analysis paralysis by providing clear, actionable prioritization under a situation of uncertainty. And then ultimately, again, to enable proactive resource allocation. Because, as I mentioned, the resources available for these types of things are becoming much reduced globally. And so with reduced funding, with reduced resources, how can we inform strategic investments before the crisis escalates? So this brings us to the sort of the agentic approach that we are taking to this particular challenge. And I want to walk through why each approach, whether that be quant, expert judgment, or AI, has its own limitations. So I think this is intuitive to most of us. There's definitely a strong there's strong momentum in this field, moving away from just generative AI to agentic models and kind of bringing in the human element, the expert judgment element in a more targeted and strategic and sequenced way. But if you just look at quantitative data alone, for this kind of a problem, this is I mentioned the 12 indicators that we're looking at. It's social, economic, political, and security challenges that are faced around the world. Quantitative data is going to be extremely messy across all of those hundreds of indicators and sub-indicators. And so you have historical data bias, you have reductionism, just looking at these quantitative metrics. It ignores context and local dynamics. The data tends to be gappy, it tends to be laggy, it tends to be noisy, and there are all kinds of static assumptions that you bring to the problem in very dynamic contexts. So you can't simply use quantitative methods alone without also bringing in these other approaches. If you only use expert judgment, as I mentioned, we used to do all these workshops with traditional rulers and government officials and civil society actors in countries around the world. And they bring a lot of insight because the local experts, they know way more than what I know about the particular problem that they're facing. Absolutely. They know way more than what the quantitative metrics alone can tell them about what the problems and challenges might be. But there is inevitably there's biases and there's limitations, there's flawed assumptions. They tend to be more reactive in the decision making. very much focused on influence-based decision-making, limited ability to assess patterns and trends. That's where quantitative metrics can kind of help out, and limited ability to strategically prioritize given all this complexity. So you can't only use quantitative methods, you can't only use expert judgment-based methods, and you can't only use generative AI for reasons that we all know. If you just use generative AI, you lose that local knowledge. You have kind of a black box. You don't have as much transparency into what's going into the analysis. You tend to perhaps be overconfident in the outputs. I know that when I generate a prompt in a workshop setting in southern Nigeria, and I hit return, and it spits out, a wonderfully formatted and eloquently articulated memo, people tend to stop talking at that point. There tends to be a bit of an overconfidence, perhaps, in the outputs, and there's less empirical grounding. So you can't just use quantitative metrics. You can't just use expert judgment. You can't just use AI. But by taking a triangulated approach, this is where we can begin to make some real progress and really scale these efforts and this analysis. You can take, by doing this, you can do in an afternoon what previously would have taken a week or two, for example, with workshops with experts in the field. So this kind of approach, it reduces blind spots. It combines the strengths of AI, quant, and expertise to avoid one-dimensional analysis. It balances rigor and context. It merges empirical data with local knowledge and lived experience. It validates and challenges assumptions. That's huge. That part is really important. Because it enables you to kind of red team, like in the military they talk about red team, where you do your planning and then you have a red team that's supposed to poke holes in the plan. So this kind of approach really helps to red team the scenario plans that people are developing. It facilitates better decision making and ultimately promotes trust and accountability through a transparent process and encourages strategic foresight. So this is sort of the heart of the approach that we've been taking with SAS Data for Good with this tool, and it's been really exciting to see how it's been taken up by our partners around the world. So the crisis sensitivity simulator, it enables brainstorming. It helps teams to explore a range of potential outcomes. I mentioned the red teaming by facilitating alternative analysis, by challenging assumptions. Ultimately, in order to do some scenario planning, and it's not a replacement for local knowledge, because local knowledge ultimately is extremely important, of course. Without local knowledge, none of this is going to work. So let me see what time I got here.
We've got another good 5 minutes.
Oh man, okay. So let me just zip through this. I'm so sorry. So what we did, we applied this in the Niger Delta. The crisis sensitivity simulator this is a quote from a partner who really liked it a lot. You can see people around the table doing their expert judgments based on the data that we've been collecting. Here's a couple news articles that were published about this cool deployment of the tool that we did in the Niger Delta. And here's the tool. So this is a box plot. This is the first step of the process. You look at using the tool, you can kind of identify a type of shock in a particular country. How impactful will that be? How destabilizing will that be? The more it shifts to the left, the more destabilizing. From the gray is baseline, and then below you can see various indicators. The ones that shift farthest to the left are more destabilizing. The tool looks at 20 years of data to identify correlates. So each country has its own unique profile of crisis sensitivity. And on the top, you can see the correlates for Nigeria to trace the second order effects of the flood crisis. And then on the right, you see more of a systems map of how the various indicators relate to each other, and how if you were to have like a shock to security apparatus, what are the other indicators that might be impacted in the situation in Nigeria. And then you bring in the expert judgment. So you have people, they sit around a table, they look at those correlates, and then they build out their scenarios based on what the variables that were surfaced through the model. And then you run the prompt generator. So this is where the AI comes in. And I may not have time to actually show you the live tool, but first you select your country and subregion. So this is Nigeria. Then you go to the drop-down and you pick, say, Rivers State. This is the state that we were in Nigeria when we did it. And then you have, what indicator and shock type are you most worried about? So now we were most worried about flooding, because that was what the government was concerned about. That's also what the tool was saying is a very high impactful shock in the case of Nigeria. So we select flood, and then you submit the prompt. So then the prompt generator will create a big prompt. It's like a very thick, detailed prompt based on the correlates that were identified by the model. And so based on those drop-downs and based on the model, we know that if there's a flood, there's going to be these 3 indicators that are going to be highly impacted. And so we have long, dense definitions for each of the variables, and that automatically gets built into this prompt. And then you can submit the prompt, and it will generate a very detailed scenario against which the partners can plan. And then the next step is you reconcile the expert-based judgment that the participants build out their scenarios with the scenario plan that was built out by the model, by the crisis sensitivity simulator, and then you can go back iteratively into the model to add additional context from the expert judgment-based scenarios to deepen areas of interest, and then correct for any hallucinations or gaps, if any, were identified in the workshop. And then let me see if I can make this video work. Probably I can't. Oops. Oh, here we go. It's okay. It's not that important. It's just going to show you drop-downs coming down and everything. So this will just show you it picks the country, it picks the shock, it generates the prompt, and it's very impressive and exciting when you see it. You can just have to imagine it in your head. Ultimately, we're really excited about the tool because our partners are really excited about the tool. And it enables us to leverage AI for crisis planning, to help people anticipate, to think systematically, to empower local action, and to, it promotes trust and ownership. It breaks the bias loops, and so on. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that I may have time to answer. And I apologize for going on and on. Thank you very much.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you, Nate. Please, a round of applause for Nate. That was excellent. Did you want to look at the dashboard real quick, or do you want to just take some questions?
I know most of you are probably interested in the dashboard and the quant and everything, and I'd be happy to kind of show you that.
So he's got it ready in the back. So show of hands. Do you want to see the dashboard that he created inside? Okay. All right.
Terrific.
I think so. Well, go ahead. I'll let you do that, and Joe will switch you over. And while Nate's doing that, if you want to hang out for some questions as soon as he gets done giving us an idea of a quick look at the dashboard, I'll walk around with the microphone. You can ask Nate any questions. Maybe not any question, but questions related to this.
All right. I guess you can still hear me. I'm still mic'd up here. So this here, if I've selected Nigeria, you can see you go to Nigeria, and then this kind of shows you the fragile states index trends across various indicators over time. You can pick the cohesion indicators, the economic indicators, the political indicators, and then over here on the right, you see a matrix. It's a correlation matrix, and you can see which indicators are most correlated with which indicators. And then this is our initial box plots that we produce in order to really help identify which types of variables are going to be most destabilizing in a particular country based on historical trends. And so that helps us to really kind of operationalize or parameterize the specific scenario plan around the specific problem that we're most concerned about. And then you come here, and this is the AI piece. And what it will do is, say I pick Nigeria, say I go down here and I pick River State, as I mentioned. And then you can see that the prompt changed. And so it'll say, considering historical trends and current conditions in River State, Nigeria, describe in detail a potential scenario where an initial trigger event, specifically, I'm going to switch it from long-term school closures to floods, demographic pressures, and then flood. Now we see it says flood. And then you see sub-indicator 2, 3, and 4. And those are based on the correlates. So, I showed you the correlate matrix earlier, and then it'll pick the ones that are the highest in terms of correlation, so to the one associated with flooding. And then I'll hit select submit prompt, and then it says start with a contextual overview of the areas, human geography, and then it tells you a little bit about what we want in terms of the scenario plan and the formatting, and then it tells you want a table at the bottom. You submit prompt, and then you wait a bit, and then it'll generate a scenario. Sometimes it takes like 30 seconds, so we don't have to wait that long. And while it's doing that, well, I'll just say here, it should be quick. There we go. So then you can see the scenario. So it starts off talking about River State is situated in the Niger Delta region, is characterized by diverse ethnic composition with predominant groups including the Ikwere, the Kalabari, and the Ogoni, and so on. And then it describes, if there's a major flood, these are going to be the impacts to the economy and the factionalized elites. It's going to be politically destabilizing. There are going to be human rights and rule of law impacts. Here are some preventative response options, and here's a brief table that kind of summarizes all of that. And then here, what we would do is we would bring everybody together we would spend about 3 days, or even an afternoon, depending on how much time we have. People would develop their scenarios, and then we would compare their scenarios with this scenario, and then we would say, okay, maybe there are some additional gaps that we want to include in the scenario, so we include that here, and then we regenerate the scenario, and it will help to enrich the scenario. And here is more information about the correlations, and then here is the systems map. And if you're interested, I can tell you a little bit about how we generate, what the difference is between the correlates and then the systems map. But I did want to give you a chance just to at least see briefly what the tool looks like. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Nate. Any questions, comments for Nate? Anyone before we let him go? Going once, going twice. Just one more round of applause, please, for Nate. That was excellent. We don't usually get the live dashboard view plus the presentation, so top marks.
Thanks, everybody.